a possible tree ordinance, which we're very interested in supporting, if in the right way, and understanding the different stakeholders there. Obviously, there are private landowners who have their wishes and needs. There was conversation earlier last year that maybe the city of Evanston wasn't in a position to go forward on a tree ordinance because we didn't have enough data. We didn't know if for example, if our canopy was decreasing or increasing. We're not so sure that matters because we think that heritage trees by definition are an asset and invaluable, regardless of whether it's increasing or decreasing. But we want to make sure that our members have the resources. So we, try to put on these talks, especially in the doldrums of winter and COVID, to hear from folks like you to share information. Lost you there.
All right, thanks. Yeah. So you mentioned heritage trees a few times. What's the definition of heritage trees that you guys are using?
So honestly, it's a work in progress for us. We've heard heritage trees talk about or refer to trees that are more than a certain size and diameter. I've heard 25 inches thrown around, for example. There's a question about what variety of trees we should be focusing on. Our friend Leslie Shadd over at Citizens Greenery Evanston, made a point to note that oaks are a really fantastic habitat, and that's not necessarily not all trees are the same in terms of the kinds of habitats that they can provide. We're also, concerned about climate change and how that might be affecting Evanston trees, how development affects Evanston trees, and how we want to approach that. So in terms of what we see heritage trees are old growth, larger trees that are, larger, that can't be replaced inside of, a lifetime or near, or a generation perhaps. So we're looking for information too. That's why we want to hear from folks in government and who care about, our landscape.
Okay. So where do you want to start?
So Michael, why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your time here in Evanston, what exactly your job is? I mean, we all might have a little bit of an idea of what the Evanston City Arborist does, but why don't you share with folks a little bit about what you do, and then we'll hear from Emily, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay. My name is Michael Callahan. I'm the city arborist and the forestry supervisor. So I'm in charge of the city's forestry crews that maintain the 32,000 more or less city-owned trees that are on public space and in the city right away. Parkway trees, trees in city parks, city hall, any publicly owned building, that sort of thing. So we have a crew of 13 right now. We have one opening, and then myself in the forestry division. And we work hand in hand with Emily in her role, but we maintain the city's trees. So when we start talking about the city's trees, I heard all kinds of things. There are heritage trees, trying to define old growth, all kinds of different terms thrown out there. So let's start with Evanston's publicly owned trees. So we have, like I said, about 32,000 more or less publicly owned trees. We have about 170 different species of trees. And of those, the vast majority are within 5 or 6 different species. So even though we have a lot of different species, most of our urban forest is comprised of a very few number of species. We're known for our American elms. I kind of mentioned those. We're losing a lot of American elms, and not because of Dutch elm disease. So we've done such a good job of keeping the trees alive that now they're starting to work their way out of the system, mainly because of climate change, mainly because of differences in moisture. We're not getting as much rainfall. I had a terrible drought last year. We're having a lot of rot and structural issues as a result of just the longevity of some of these trees. So when we start talking about Evanston trees, we're here ages thrown out or sizes. So depending on the tree species, depends on how quickly the tree grows and how large it gets. So a 100-year-old American elm is about 50 inches in diameter. So it could be up to 150, but mainly 100 years. So a lot of our elm trees that are quite large are about 100 years. We don't have very many over that anymore. Versus like an oak tree. So a 36-inch diameter oak tree is going to be about 150 years old. So while that may sound impressive, and it is, especially in an urban environment, some of these trees have the ability to grow a lot longer in a more natural setting. We have a very artificial setting, so that can limit the lifespan of an urban tree by up to 70%. So the fact that we're getting 100 to 150 years out of some of our trees, or even longer, is actually very incredible and unique. So that is something that has, there's a great deal of pride for us in trying to maintain some of these trees. But like I said, we're losing more trees, especially the elm trees, not to Dutch elm disease anymore, but because of rot and structural issues where winds are literally tearing them apart to the point to where they're structurally unsound because there's just too much rot. They're just aging out. They're just showing the impacts of old age, and we're losing a lot. We do replant as many as we can. We are planting American elms that have been shown to have great resistance to Dutch elm disease, mainly because of the cost of the program. Inoculating these trees, or that's not even inoculating, but treating them with a fungicide every 3 years at a cost of, we subcontracted out this past time, and it was over $600,000, not including what the city pays for our crews to do it. So we pay about $1 million every 3 years on our elm trees, American elms. And it's getting more and more difficult to keep some of these trees alive. Forestry department, we have started a plant healthcare side of forestry now, to where, we start talking about climate change and things. So we're trying to keep the trees alive. We're not just pruning and removing and planting. So we're actually actively trying to work with the trees, trying to do tree preservation to keep our trees alive. So that's a little bit of a shift, trying to be a little bit more proactive and get to it. We're also reinstituting sectional pruning, where we actually prune a section of town every year so that we can maximize efficiencies and reduce costs. And that way it's definitely more equitable, and it actually helps us better maintain our trees. So we reinstituted that. But I would have to say that every time we lose one of these large trees, there's no way that we can replace it. I mean, they were taking 80 to 100 years or longer to get one of these trees, and there's no way for me to plant enough trees to counter the ecological damage that happens in that situation. So this past year, we lost over 100 trees that were over 30 inches in diameter or larger. So that's a lot. Of our American elms, we're down to under 2,300. Back in like 2002, if I remember correctly, we had approximately 15,000. So we've lost a lot of trees over the years. Ash trees, emerald ash borer, we had over about 4,000 trees back in 2006, 2008. Now we have less than 300 city-owned ash trees. So we definitely are seeing a shift for a lot of different things. And my goal is to try to plant trees that are going to survive and that have an opportunity, and care for them so that they have the chance to get to 80 years, 100, 150 years. And it's just going to, that's the best we can do at this point in time. no one really knows what we're going to deal with in 10, 15 years. So, mixing up the diversity is probably the biggest challenge and the best thing we can do right now too.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. We're in this situation regardless of what we might want to see. We have to deal with what is, and understanding how there's limitation on public dollars and weighing that against what's important to maintain the beautiful Evanston canopy that we have. And I'm glad we have Emily here to speak sort of about on the public policy side, like what you are an arborist, Michael, and Emily, as our public services coordinator, you work in the public policy realm. So like, what's your role in maintaining and working with Michael to manage our resources?
Yeah, thanks. My background is in community conservation. I have a master's in community conservation. I'm also a certified arborist. And my role in the city is to help both forestry and greenways to implement their natural resource management programs. And so in some cases that does involve, looking at ordinances and looking at city code to see where there might be areas where we might be able to be more efficient or bring the code. In some cases it just needs to be updated because it might have been, 50 years since that portion of code was touched. We certainly want to reflect current trends. We want to ensure that the decisions that we're making now are, informed on the latest data. They're informed on what the community, like who the community is now, and certainly the goals of the community in the present moment. And those things change over time, of course. And the environment is changing over time. I mean, we're seeing it now, climate change is here and we're seeing it happen. So naturally, we want to ensure that our policies are reflected and reflective of what's best for both the community and also the environment, in this present moment. And so as far as, tree preservation and looking at how to use city code to have the most efficient tree preservation, so there's a lot of pieces to this. There's certainly the portion of looking at how we protect trees on public property. And that's been relatively well established. I think we have there's always room for improvement, but our tree ordinance does a relatively good job of protecting trees on public property. But most of Evanston's tree canopy, which is somewhat different from Evanston's trees, but most of the canopy cover in Evanston is actually on private property. So even, when Michael and his crews work really hard, which they do, they work really, really hard to protect and preserve and conserve the tree canopy cover, I should say, actually, on public property, that only accounts for at best maybe 30% of trees in Evanston. And I think that's why the ordinance of protecting trees on private property, that's why that's been something that we've talked about. But I want to make a distinction that, when we discuss managing trees and we discuss managing natural resources, we really approach it and we really think about it from a unified perspective. So one example that I give is that, in public works, so Michael and I both work out of Public Works. The Public Services Bureau is housed in Public Works. And in general, Public Works is an agency, it's a department in the city that manages and protects infrastructure. And that can be things like water, it can be sewer, roads, traffic lights, all that infrastructure that helps us to live more productive lives in some sense, right? It helps us to go about our everyday lives as people who live in a community, in an urban community. And trees are part of that. And we consider trees to be infrastructure. And the reason that we consider trees to be infrastructure is because they provide a benefit. They are a resource and they provide a benefit. They provide us with things that help us to have more productive lives. So for example, when it's 100 degrees and it's been dry for a really long time, I think most of us, and this is something that we'll see, congregate under trees. We're happy to congregate under trees when we're outside. We don't want to be outside in the middle of pavement, on a blazing hot day. And they also help us to feel happier and healthier. They help with cardiovascular health. They reduce asthma rates because they reduce, air pollution and toxins and things like that. They reduce flooding, so they help to manage stormwater. And unlike most infrastructure, they actually appreciate in value over time. So basically, the minute you put in any type of man-made infrastructure, like a road or sewer or water or whatever it is, it actually starts to deteriorate, with maybe a couple exceptions. Concrete does cure over time, but for the most part, man-made infrastructure does start to deteriorate sort of immediately as you put it in. Trees, on the other hand, are actually appreciate in value. So they become more beneficial and exponentially more beneficial as they get bigger. So that is something that we don't take lightly. But as we think about the way that we manage trees, it's sort of the same way that we manage everything else in public works, and that's as a community. So we often get requests, this is a sort of a very simple one to explain, but we often get requests to have the timing on traffic lights changed. So someone will call in and say, this traffic light isn't really serving our community in the best way possible. Is there any way we can change it? And the answer is yes, but we can't just look at that individual traffic light. We have to look at the entire network of traffic lights, within the block. And there's very smart people that we work with who know exactly what they're doing, and they know what the process is to go about examining this. They have to do a study, and they have to look at this, and you have to look at the entire neighborhood, maybe even beyond the neighborhood. That's out of my realm. I don't know anything about that. But the same is true for trees, right? The same is true for not only trees, but basically all of our green infrastructure, all of our natural resources throughout town. We can't make decisions that are based solely or entirely on individuals. In some cases we have to, in some cases, if there's a tree that's hazardous and posing a threat, of course we make a decision on that tree, based on that immediate need. But overall, when we make decisions about planting trees, about managing trees, about even removing trees, Michael and his crews will look at the entire neighborhood, right? They consider how this is going to impact, and actually not even the neighborhood, really the entire city. It might not be sort of the same algorithms as traffic lights, because the timing doesn't have to coincide, but it is still it's not just a hyper local consideration in the sense that we don't just look at that one tree, we look at the entire area. And the same is true for trees on private property. So when we consider how best can we start to look at managing trees on private property, so implementing a tree preservation ordinance that is going to impose, replacement for people who want to manage their trees on private property, then how is that going to impact the entire neighborhood? And that is going to be something that is going to not just look at, the private trees, but also the public trees. So how do we ensure that we are maintaining diversity? And how do we ensure that, when we are asking people to take a community approach to managing their trees, which is essentially what we're doing, that the decisions that are being made are going to have a net positive effect, or have sort of a utilitarian best positive effect for the entire community. And so that's a little bit about, the thoughts that we've had to consider when we consider regulating trees on private property. And part of that also is that, there are livelihood considerations. So I've gone to ward meetings now, and the majority of the wards, there was one ward that does not have regular monthly meetings. There's a couple other wards that had really pressing matters. There was a shooting at in one ward that has, understandably taken over the conversation in that part of the community. And so one of the things that we're extremely sensitive to is that there are things, and this last year and a half has been actually going on 2 years now, has been incredibly difficult for, a part of this community. And so how do we start talking about how people manage their own livelihoods, while considering that we're asking them to take on another portion of that management if we're asking, for permits to manage trees on private property. And the other thing is obviously equity. So one of the most important things that we do in public works is that, like I said, because we manage infrastructure from a community standpoint, and we think about how decisions on individual locations are going to impact the entire community, we also have to think about how we distribute benefits equitably. And I say equitably because I really do mean equitably. I do not mean equally. So it's not necessarily true that we are going to plant the same number of trees in each neighborhood or on each street or on each block, or we're going to replant them in the same, in the same way, or even manage them in the same way, because neighborhoods don't have equal needs. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing the needs that they have equitably, and that the benefits, especially, so the net positive that we gain from having good canopy cover, we want to make sure that those benefits are distributed equitably. And there are some things that are working against us. There are some current conditions, current trends in tree canopy cover that have created inequities throughout town. There's also capacity. So certain parts of town are able to, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess host a certain amount of tree canopy cover, and that's not distributed equally or equitably throughout town.
Yeah.
And so
the town's actually set up. When we start talking about tree preservation, we're talking about managing root space. So that's number one for preserving any tree, is maximizing the root space. And when you have an urban environment, you have different amounts of root area that you can have a tree. And that really changes what you can and cannot do with tree preservation. And when you start looking around town, you see lot sizes a lot different, depending on where you're at in one part of town and the other. You see parkway sizes dramatically different from one part in town to another. So, I mean, we have parkways, for example, that are only 18 inches. I only have 18 inches between the curb and the sidewalk to try to put a tree in. It's not going to work, because the city has historically been maintained and designed to maximize building footprints at the expense of green space. And that is limiting what we can do. And when you start talking about tree preservation on some of these properties, it's a lot easier to do tree preservation on a lot where you have an additional 5,000 square feet to work with, versus some of these other lots where you may be wanting to try to save a tree with less than 1,000 square foot of available root zone area. And it really changes. So in one situation, you can probably preserve a tree. The other situation, you probably can't if you're going to do any work on it. So how do you make that equitable and make it to where it's fair for all parties involved, when not everybody's playing with the same, not everybody has the same conditions to start with. So it's very individualized, and it's very difficult to sit there and come up with a one size fits all approach for this. And the biggest goal for me is that, I think a lot of this has been that we've seen some situations around town where we've had some large trees unfortunately removed, that, some oak trees here and there. But more importantly is that it's not just removing those trees, it's the impact to a neighbor's property and their trees. So, it's one of those situations to where we have to look at the whole situation and try to figure out how we're going to make it work for everyone. And when you start talking about regulating somebody's private property, you get just as many answers as opinions when it comes to how it should be implemented. And that is something that is very difficult to sort through and to meet the needs of the community as a whole over that necessarily of an individual. And that's a very tough balancing act to try to figure that out.
Certainly, there are municipalities that do have various kinds of, you know, regulation for private property trees. You know, Emily, like, you know, I hear Michael, you know, one size does not fit all, but also it's very labor intensive to take a case by case basis. Sometimes, I mean, there has to be staff, there has to be funding for that staff to make those appropriate choices. You know, and also, I mean, I'm fond of, you know, the adage that we don't want to make the perfect enemy of the good here either, and that's really what, you know, public policy is all about, is trying to find, you know, a way forward. You know, in your mind, what does that way forward look like in terms of preserving Evanston's tree canopy?
Yeah, so I've spoken to my peers in neighboring communities. You know, there's a fair amount of communities throughout the North Shore that have tree preservation ordinances for trees on private property. And the sort of number one feedback that I've gotten from my peers is that asking people to pay a lot of money when they want to cut down their valuable trees is not a good solution, because well, for a few reasons. One is that it doesn't actually preserve trees, it doesn't actually protect trees, which is what these ordinances are meant to do. Or they're sort of, the idea is that they're meant to do that. You know, if we look at it from a net benefits perspective, you know, we know that, okay, well, if we plant, you know, if we have a 20-inch tree, and we plant trees typically at around a 2-inch diameter, you know, the trees that we plant are around 2 inches in diameter, sometimes 1 if it's on private property. You know, the idea is, okay, well, then we would have to plant 10 trees or 20 trees if it's at a 1-inch diameter in order to make up that 20 inches. And that's just not true. It's actually something like 100-fold. We would have to plant, you know, not just 10 times as many, but about 100 times as many. And even then, some of the trees that, you know, some of the benefits that those trees are providing are just not available. So a 20-inch tree is going to, I mean, the most basic one I can say is that a 20-inch tree is going to provide a ton of shade, and you can plant as many 2-inch trees as you want, and you will never, ever achieve that shade because they're just not big enough to do that. Not to mention, you know, squirrels nesting in the tree. A squirrel's not going to nest in the 2-inch tree. That's just not going to happen. You know, the same is true for other types of habitat. And the stormwater retention as well. I just don't think that's going to happen with however many 2-inch trees we want to plant. And we don't have the space, quite frankly, to be able to put in that many trees to get to those benefits. And so if the idea is that we're making people pay a lot of money when they take those trees out in order to replace the value, you know, but then we're not really getting the value, then that sort of does not achieve the goal of protecting the benefits that that we want to protect. And on the sort of on the other side of that is that asking people to pay a lot of money is going to place an undue burden on a certain segment of the population. And, you know, that's also like just not fair or equitable, right? That certain people are going to be able to pay their way out of removing very large trees and other people are not. And so that just makes it incredibly difficult. And it is made even more difficult by the fact that, you know, the last couple of years has demonstrated that, you know, that the last couple of years have been more difficult on certain parts of this community than others. And we don't want to continue to create, you know, that undue burden. And so I think that, you know, I've been thinking about this quite a bit over the last few months. And one thing is, I mean, you know, I want to make something clear, which is that, like, I am absolutely a tree hugger and I absolutely want to protect trees and I absolutely do want to preserve trees. And, you know, I don't want people to cut trees down in their own backyards. But I also want people to be able to lead fruitful lives and to be able to use their properties and their homes in the way that is, you know, most beneficial to them. But I don't know that assigning, you know, steep fines is really the way to do that, or steep replacement values or steep penalties or whatever it is that you want to call them. And so, you know, I think that the answer has to be something that has more to do with, you know, developing a way to work around cutting trees down, or to, you know, create a permitting process maybe that, you know, requires more, you know, more work to be done by the community member in order to, I don't want to say justify, but in order to demonstrate that this tree really does need to be removed in order to achieve, best livelihood achievement by that community member. And you're right that it has to be a case-by-case basis, but there also has to be some sort of, there has to be some sort of framework so that it's not applied subjectively throughout the community. It's got to be something that can be applied objectively. And it would require an increase in staff.
In terms of looking at this, I mean, like any public servants, Michael, you have limited staff, I'm sure, over your time here, and you've been frustrated at moments about the lack of funding for your department. I mean, where do you see your department and where folks who care about these things can advocate to our representatives, or how would you like to see your department change or grow, or where do you see the need at most significantly?
So, excuse me, I kind of alluded to, I was talking about this earlier. We need to do more in the terms of keeping the trees healthy, minimizing stress on them, and working to protect the opportunity for them to have the longevity that we want from them. So shifting some of our focus and some of our training and expertise into actually caring for the trees, doing root stimulants, doing mulching, doing cultural things, making sure we don't have insect and disease outbreaks that are claiming trees. That's someplace that we need to go, and that we have changed, and we have started to do some of that. But also the biggest thing for us operationally is that we have to get back to and stick to a strict maintenance schedule of the tree, so that we're pruning every single tree, or looking and or caring for every single tree minimum once every 7 years. Because right now, a lot of that has been, you call into 311, you request something, you say that there's an issue, and we come out and evaluate it, and we address it as well as we can. But unfortunately, that has really, while it's actually helped serve the individual, it's been at the detriment of the whole. So it's really run us all around town, instead of letting us concentrate on areas where we know the trees need the attention the most, and that we need to address things before they become a bigger problem. Younger trees need more attention earlier and more frequent than the mature trees. And typically, people assume that's just the opposite. They assume that the large trees need to be cared for far more frequently. Large shade trees, say a large oak tree, a 36-inch diameter oak tree, is only going to need to be pruned, deadwood pruned, once every 7 to 8 years for the most part. A small tree that's under 15 inches in diameter should be pruned at least probably 3 times in the same time frame. So it's one of those things to where we have to get back to serving the whole over the individual. And that's very difficult at times, because everybody pays taxes, and everybody wants their trees to look good. But we've had situations since I've been in Evanston, and I'm going on 4 years, where we've had people call up 4 times since I've been here wanting the tree pruned. And we shouldn't be pruning a tree. It's
kind of the same as like with people, right? So for those of us who have young kids, when you do the work of disciplining and showing your kids the right way when they're young, then hopefully the hope, right, is that they might need fewer interventions when they're older,
Exactly.
Because they've gotten that good care when they're young,
Yeah.
right? Or like brushing your teeth every day when you're younger might mean better dental health in the long run. So
longevity of the trees, and trying to, again, shift species diversity, try to get better diversity, trying to get trees that will tolerate climate change a little bit better, and just making sure that we're just doing the best we can with trying to make sure that people understand that these are all of our trees, and we all want to do the best for them. sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes it's difficult. So staffing is what staffing is. You know, the council's always been very generous with tree planting budget. It's really not a factor of funding certain things as much as being able to get the quantity and the quality that we want.
Trees?
Yes. You know, there's a lot of nurseries that we deal with out there, but you know, a couple years ago, you know, we had that polar vortex. There were some nurseries that lost an extremely high amount of stock that they had, and tree prices are starting to creep up because of this. Had some major storms that have come through that certain municipalities are, you know, starting to plant a lot more, so that's driving the prices up. But you know, for the most part, you know, the city council and the city manager's office and everybody has always been very, very responsive when we've made requests for things, and you know, so we just do the best we can.
No, and that's the job of any good public servant, and you know, we thank you for that. You know, I mean, I think for those of us who are on this call tonight, I think, you know, of course, we want to know what issues are facing, you know, the tree canopy here, but we also are interested in knowing how we can participate and how we can help. You know, I'm not totally aware of what kinds of, you know, sort of PSAs the city does as it relates to trees, but people want to know, you know, how to take care of their trees. What, you know, you mentioned that, you know, these older growth trees don't need a lot of work. You know, what are things that everyday folks can do to be part of the solution to preserve our canopy?
You know, a lot of it is that, you know, if you see something that doesn't look right, you know, call into 311 and let us know about it. You know, if you see a tree struggling in this during the green season, you know, something obvious, or if you see that somebody's, you know, done damage to a tree, or a tree just doesn't look right, you know, let me know so that we can go out and inspect it. Because that's how we find certain things. You know, that's how we find insect and disease issues around town. You know, we had a major outbreak of Lacanium scale this year, especially on swamp white oaks. And that's how we found out about it, was from the public letting us know, hey, this tree just doesn't look right. Don't know what it is, but it's something just isn't right. And by phoning in, and then once we had enough of those, you know, and we were able to identify, okay, we have an insect issue here. And then we could come up with a management plan on how we're going to address that and how to try to keep some of these swamp white oaks alive, because it was impacting everything from our newly transplanted swamp white oaks all the way up to the large ones, you know, the 40-inch ones. So, you know, being able to do some things then and adjust our regimen to help minimize the stress of this for the trees actually has helped save trees. So if something doesn't look right, it probably isn't. And just give us a call, and, you know, because we can't be everywhere at one time, but if you see a tree struggling, let me know about it, because then we can see if we can address it.
Mulch is also another really big one. So, you know, maintaining a good, healthy mulch ring around the tree. And there are some tips for doing that appropriately. So volcano mulching, which is something that we see a lot around town, is actually incorrect. And when you find out about this, you will think, well, all the trees are mulched this way. And it's true. 90%, maybe even 95, 99% of trees are mulched incorrectly. Mulch should not touch the trunk of the tree. So you want to remember to mulch soil and not tree. So that's just a quick one, but maintaining a good layer of mulch around the tree is one of the very best things that anybody can do for a tree in an urban environment, either on public property or on private property. If we get, you know, another, you know, depending on what the summer looks like, I mean, we had a major drought this past year. So watering the tree, you know, watering trees, although not over watering them, is another way to help trees, especially through those difficult moments. We try very hard to put out, you know, items on social media when we see that the weather conditions are difficult for the trees. We try to put that out on social media. So on Twitter, on Facebook, we rely on the city to help us with that, to try and let the community know, hey, you know, if you have extra time, if you're able to water, now is a good time to do it. And the amount of water that's appropriate for the conditions that we're facing. So those are two things that, can be done. I would say annually. Mulch you might not need to put every year, but that's something that's sort of like a proactive thing that the community can do, even with healthy trees. So trees don't even need to be suffering to get that treatment.
Yeah, mulching is the single best investment you can make in tree care.
Yeah. And that applies. And, the other thing too is coming back to this idea that, not this idea, but the fact that the majority of trees are actually on private property. For those community members who are homeowners, managing your trees actually on private property is going to have a huge impact on Evanston's tree canopy cover. Just making sure that the trees that are, in your backyards, your side yards, your front yards, but not on public property, making sure that they're also getting love, so that, that a certified arborist is looking at them like every 5 years or so, or more frequently if you're seeing things, or more frequently if they've been planted. All the same things that Michael has said, apply to private trees as well. And so ensuring that we're contributing to tree canopy cover throughout the entire town and not just on public property is really going to go a long way, given that there are so many trees on private property.
Well, thank you both. If you're all right, we have time, we'd like to open it up to the group for some Q&A. So for all of you out there, just go ahead and raise your hand using that function, and then I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute, and then you can ask your question. First, I've got a question from Alan Pilgrim.
Actually, it's Sigrid Pilgrim, but no, that's quite okay because the Zoom runs under my husband's name. I wanted to get back to what Emily said about watering trees. We happen to have a very large backyard, and we live in Northwest Evanston. And I do remember very well, getting a call from the city through various newsletters about making sure that you water the trees. I wanted to make a suggestion. If I'm looking at my water bill, the sewer surcharge is 60% higher on the base cost than the actual cost of the water. And of course, that multiplies proportionally if you exceed the basic amount of water, which I'm sure everybody does. If I am watering the very large trees that are on the city property in the parkway, and if I'm watering my backyard trees, as you were suggesting, why do I have to pay 60% more of the water that I'm using that is actually not going into the sewer? So my suggestion would be, and I know that this above and beyond your role in public works, that maybe the city could take a good look and calculate, say, for the months of October through June, what is the average amount of water that the household uses? And of course, the amount of sewer surcharge that is being charged at 60% more than what the base rate is. Then let's take a look at how much water are we using July, August, September, October, or maybe, August, September, October. In my case, it was about 4 times the amount that we normally pay in the month of March. And it's just my husband and me, because of the fact that I was watering the back of our backyard, and because I was watering the big trees in front of my house. Maybe there would be a way that the sewer surcharge for those months could be reduced, say by 50% or 30%, or whatever the city wants to come up with. I think that would be an incentive for more people to start watering trees, because of the fact that the sewer surcharge is so much more than what the actual cost of the water is. And again, if I'm watering the trees, it's not going into the sewers. So it's just a little bit of a seed I wanted to put into your minds to keep in mind.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for taking care of your trees throughout this last year. This last summer was an incredibly difficult year for trees. Michael and I had, frequent conversations about how worried we are for the state of the trees and not just, not just the effects that we saw last year, but also effects going forward over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I think we are going to continue to see the effects of this past summer. And that doesn't even consider, whatever crazy climate we're going to get, in the next couple of years. But not to be doom and gloom. The message actually is thank you. It's a happy message. And also thank you for your comments about the sewer surcharge. And you are correct, completely above my head. It's interesting to think about.
I would like to mention that the more mulch you have, as far as larger area that you mulch, the less you're going to need to water supplementally. Yeah. And if your landscaping is more of a natural landscaping style that complements the tree species that you have, you're going to have fewer issues as well. So, taking a look at that, a large mature parkway tree, it's really not that feasible to water something that size. You're just not going to get enough water onto it. But mulching it is by far the best thing, because a tree's main enemy is turf. Turf and trees compete. They're completely two different ecosystems. Turf grass, let me just reiterate that, turf grass, not native grasses, but turf grass is by far just a terrible thing for trees. So minimizing the turf grass and having a more natural landscaping, especially with the climate change, will definitely go a lot farther.
So just to clarify, when there are calls during like the drought, that we experienced last summer, to water our trees, it's not that we should water our 30-inch heritage trees, that we should water our smaller trees. Is that what you're?
The smaller trees are where we're going to have the most impact. So the larger trees, you start looking, think of a large tree can have a root system that extends 1 to 1.5 times the height of the tree. So even if it's in the parkway and you're watering your entire front yard, you pretty much have to also have your neighbors water their front yards too, on either side. It's just really not that feasible. And larger trees that are performing well don't need to be watered artificially as much, but by all means, mulch is the best bet.
Got it. Thanks a lot. And thanks, Ms. Pilgrim. Next up, we have Isato.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Isadora. I don't know why it comes up that way, and I don't know how to change it.
No worries.
I have thanks. I have a few short things. Should I say them one at a time or all together?
It's up to you.
Okay. One is, you mentioned shifting the kind of trees that we have because of the expectation of climate change and its impacts. I'm wondering what trees you are finding or aiming to plant now. What varieties?
A lot of that also depends on what I can find. So
okay,
it's one of those things to where it changes yearly a little bit, simply because of what has come out of the nurseries and things that we're having problems with. And I'll use an example. We used to plant a lot of London plane trees, a decent amount, not a lot, but a decent amount. And one winter we lost probably 70% of the London plane trees that we planted and from the previous year. So we kind of pulled that off because we were having problems with that. A lot of people were, until that. I really think it's something that came from the nursery stock. I think there was a bad round of root systems or something, root stock that was used. And so I want to have a chance for all that to get worked out of the nurseries before we start planting them again. But there are trees that we know that are native that are going to do well. We have a lot of native oaks that perform very well in Evanston, depending on what part of town. We know American elms perform very well. That's why we started planting those again, the ones that have been shown to be more resistant to Dutch elm disease. Besides Dutch elm disease, American elm is probably the perfect urban tree. So we've been planting those. We had a kind of a moratorium for a long time on planting maples. We've started up planting maples again because we know we're going to be losing a lot of non-native Norway maples before long, but we don't want to lose the maple component that we have. So we're trying to bring back certain natives that we have that we haven't planted for a while, but it changes a lot. You know, I would say the main thing that we see right now, a lot of for people requesting are the native oaks, you know, black oak, white oak, swamp white oak. Those are the big ones that I get asked about a lot. Bur oak is a big one. So it just depends on where you're at in town, what the soils are and what performs. So when I have a list of species that we provide, not all those trees are available in all locations. So we've kind of redid our planting this year so that it's more of a prescription based. You get a choice based off of the neighborhood and what's in your neighborhood and what your neighbors have, so that we don't have a monoculture in an area. So it's not just planting, you know, one specific type of tree one place or the other. It's a lot more diverse. So we've been planting black gum, sweet gum. Like I said, we've been hitting on some maples. You know, we've even planted some Osage orange around town here and there, fruitless and thornless Osage orange. But I think we typically have about 15 different species, but I don't have the list on me right now.
Okay, thank you. And ginkgos would be on that list?
Ginkgos are very rare now. Ginkgos used to be more of a staple. Ginkgos from a ecological standpoint don't provide a whole lot.
Other than shade, but
Other than shade, but insects don't really feed on them. They really don't provide much in regards to wildlife for the most part. So ginkgos are definitely, we still plant them, but it's limited quantities, very limited, probably less than five a planting season. And most of those, actually all those are request only.
Okay, thank you. And I'm glad to hear you mention Norway maples. I know on the southern blocks of Hinman, Norway maples dying, cut down, etc.
Yeah.
What's the problem with the Norway maples?
80% of the problems we have with Norway maples are girdling root systems, where the tree is literally choking itself to death underground. The root system is wrapped around the trunk of the tree, and it is, as the tree root grows larger in diameter and the trunk goes larger, they start pressing against each other, and the root actually girdles and chokes off that side of the tree. So that's what we have a lot of problems with the Norway maples.
and in broader terms, they're aging out as well. Okay.
Yeah.
From when they were planted. I mean,
Yeah, about 35 years. When they get about Norway maples, when they get 35 years, here we start having problems with them.
Understood. Thank you. And when you cut one down, for example, how long do you have to wait before you plant new trees in that same spot or that
It
same
depends. There's not so we've been working, trying to get, when a tree is cut down in specific areas, that they get replanted, because if you think about it, so if you have an apartment complex or a condo building that services 30 people or 30 families, and they may have, let's say, 5 parkway trees, city-owned trees in front of the building. If they lose one, it's very impactful to that building and to those 30 families, because they only have 5 trees. Versus if I have another property, single family home in town that has 5 city trees on it, if they lose one, it's not as impactful. You know, you start looking at the benefits and you start talking about equity. So we used to do first in, first out. So where a tree was removed first is where it got replaced. But now we're trying to look at the benefits of the neighborhood and the tree canopy and where the benefits are a little bit, and trying to work that route too. So sometimes it takes a little bit longer to get into some of these areas, but that's what we're trying to do, is trying to make sure that we're getting trees back in areas where they have the most benefit for the most number of people quicker.
Thank you for that. And then my last question is, I've noticed the volcano mulching along Ridge by St. Francis.
Yes.
Can anything be done about that?
You know, we've looked at that. Those are actually planted a lot higher than people think. For whatever reason, they planted those trees, those elms really, really high. 3 years ago, we bought a specialty tool called an air spade, which allows us to use an air to blast the soil away. And we've been using that a lot. And that is actually on our list to go explore those root systems of those trees and to see what the proper level is. But the ones I've looked at, I think those trees were planted really, really high for some reason. And I don't know if there's going to be that much that we're going to be able to do about some of those.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks, Isadora.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Barry Goldberg.
Thank you. When I walk along Michigan Avenue, I notice that there's trees that are right alongside the street side of the sidewalk. And I can imagine when they were originally planted, there was some room. But now the trees have grown and the roots have developed so that they're actually lifting the sidewalk up. So that from a walking point of view, it's really kind of dangerous. How badly does that damage the tree? And what does the city do if the sidewalk is replaced and to accommodate the tree?
Great question. So right now, it's probably not damaging the tree at all. The tree's damaging the concrete. So when we get these complaints and we go out and investigate it, they make a determination on what can be done. So if it can be repaired or it can be mitigated so that it's not a tripping hazard, they'll do that. If it's determined that the sidewalk needs to be replaced, then they will work with me on that to see how best to work around the tree. Sometimes we're able to curve around the tree. Sometimes we're not able to do anything. And they end up just putting it right back on top, knowing that it's going to, in another 10 years, be another problem. But, you know, we try to minimize the damage, or we try to look at the tree too. And if the tree is on its way out, then we're making a determination that, you know, do the best that you can, try not to damage it too much, but the tree's probably not going to be around in 10 years because, you know, for one situation or another, like a Norway maple with girdling roots, we know the time's limited. So we're probably not going to do a lot to mitigate that other than just try to not to, you know, beat up the root system too much. So it's on a case-by-case basis. And I work with the individuals that do the sidewalk replacement programs. And, you know, we do work to try to minimize damage to the trees.
Thank you. The other comment I want to make is about 2 years ago, I think we had not drought, we had excessive rain. And early in the evening, we lost an enormous, call it a branch. I think it was about 8 or 9 inches in diameter. And it fell off the tree and fell on the car. And we called 311. And your guys were out there so fast at 10 o'clock at night and did just the most beautiful job of taking the thing apart. And when they got done, it was so clean that you wouldn't even know they were there. So I wrote a letter. I was so impressed with how nice these guys were and how well they worked. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us damaged tree owners.
Sorry for the damage, but appreciate the feedback and the compliment. Thank you very much. And I'll let them know tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing the positive feedback. We often hear from community members when we have issues. And I can tell you that it makes a huge difference to Michael's crew members when they get, you know, when they hear that they're doing a good job and it's well appreciated. That's just incredibly helpful. You know, for them and for the work that they do and for how hard they work to try and get things done as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Honestly, I mean, we're living in a time where there's, you know, less civility than I think we'd all like to see. And, just listening to Barry there, like brought a smile to my face, to hear, there are a lot of challenges that we all have, and things are imperfect, but I think, we should all take a note from Barry and give credit where credit's due when we come across it.
Thank you. I also, I just want to piggyback a little bit on something Michael said. I think it's always, good to, it's a good reminder that, and I'm sorry, I think I'm going to break a lot of hearts with what I'm about to say, but trees are really lazy, especially tree roots, and they will often take the path of least resistance. And so and this is kind of like, and I say this because, I think a lot of the people on this call probably love trees, as do we, as Michael and I do. But the truth is that sometimes they can really be quite lazy. And so oftentimes when they do come into contact with, especially man-made infrastructure, and they do damage that infrastructure, that usually there is some sort of pre-existing condition in that infrastructure that allows the tree roots to damage it. Because if it were really hard, the tree roots would not be doing it. They would just move on to a different area that is easier to populate.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's helpful to remember that as we manage trees.
Yeah, I have a heritage tree on my lot that is growing into my garage that is probably 100 years old itself, and pretty sure if we all on this Zoom call got together and pushed on the north side of my garage, the whole thing might fall down. But we got Jean Prindeville, who's also our SEA vice president. Let's hear from her.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk tonight. This was really interesting. I just had a real quick question about where the city is on implementing an ordinance that does include protecting trees on private property. And then secondly, how could an organization such as Southeast Evanston Association assist in the efforts that you guys are trying to do?
So as far as the process, this ordinance, draft of this ordinance was brought to the Planning and Development Committee last May. And it did not make it out of committee. That ordinance draft called for a tree preservation permit to apply to any type of development on private property that would increase the impermeable surface area by 600 square feet. Then that would trigger the need for a tree preservation ordinance. So that stayed in the Planning and Development Committee. And originally that ordinance was brought by Community Development. That's the department, the city department that wrote it. But in staying in the committee, it actually bounced to PWA, so the Public Works Agency. So essentially with us. And we have been working to redraft the ordinance. I took that project on. And as part of taking that project on, I went to the wards. I spoke with the Environment Board, first of all, and then I also have been doing presentations at ward meetings throughout town, so each of the wards, to sort of get some feedback and to understand from the community what their thoughts are, what their concerns are, especially. I wanted to ensure that, as we're writing this ordinance, there were not unintended consequences that would come up that could have been easily resolved by speaking to the community ahead of time. And so I did that work throughout fall of last year, this past fall, and went to these ward meetings. And we are now, so that outreach is now complete. I've gone back to the Environment Board, and my next step is to go back to City Council and to let them know, to speak to the council and to say, okay, well, this is what we know. We know that we want to preserve trees. And we also know that we want to do this in a way that does not, have the unintended consequence of placing an undue burden on a certain segment of the population by requiring, really heavy replacement costs when they remove trees on their private property. And so I am looking for direction from City Council. I think that there's a couple items that we want to ensure happen. So preserving trees is one of those. but also doing so in a way that, you know, is equitable, and that considers the livelihood development of the community. And so I'm hoping that City Council will be able to provide that direction as to how to do that most effectively. And so that will be coming up in the next, you know, couple months.
Okay. And then is there anything that we can do at this point to assist you with that? Or do you just need to go through the process?
I mean, yes and yes. So I do need to go through the process. And as far as assistance, you know, I'm always happy for assistance. I'm always happy, you know, when the community wants to advocate what, you know, for things that would improve, you know, the way a community functions. I don't know. I think at this point, you know, I guess I just don't know personally how best to create this ordinance in a way that is equitable. And so that's certainly something that, you know, that I'm looking for direction from City Council. But I mean, if other people have ideas, you know, of course, like that's, you know, that's something that that of course, you know, people should consider. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Well,
Yeah, Jean?
thank you very much. That's really helpful.
And to follow up on what Jean said, I mean, so it sounds like a significant part of this, the problem is just finding the best way forward. But in terms of the support, the political support that you need to get, you know, something like this passed, I mean, obviously it'll depend on what indeed the ordinance looks like in the end. But, you know, do you see a space for, you know, community organizations such as ourselves to put political pressure on our, you know, on our aldermen, our alders, to move forward on an ordinance like that? Is that why it didn't make it out of committee, or is it just we just didn't have? Was it the lack of political support for it, or is it we just needed to refine it?
It didn't make it out of committee because we didn't have the staffing, you know, the personnel that could even address it at that point in time. And it was one of those situations to where we needed to, you know, all that was done before Emily came on board. And that was one of the reasons why Emily was brought on board and why she's been working on this diligently since she basically set feet in the office. This has been one of her main projects that she's been working on. So it was tabled because of some staffing issues and some other items. And the equity is one of them, trying to figure out how we make it equitable. And I don't envy her with this. It's a very daunting task. And so that's why it was tabled. You know, that's when I was going to meetings and everything on that, is that we just didn't have the personnel to do it.
Got it.
Do you feel that you have a lot of support from the aldermen?
You know, we're very lucky in Evanston with the council that for the most part, you know, Evanston's known for its trees, and the trees and the environment are extremely important to many of the community members. And, you know, that joint voice has been heard, and most of the council members are very in tune to that need and desire of, you know, the community members that want that. So it never hurts to have conversations with your council member about, you know, the green infrastructure here. For the most part, I would say that we're very well received on things that we present.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming out tonight. You know, just giving us listeners a chance to understand a little bit about where we're at and the needs that we have. And just, you know, sort of pulling back the curtain a little bit, you know, we see, you know, our infrastructure, our tree infrastructure, and we see that it, you know, is hurting in places, and we don't necessarily understand why. You know, I mean, Norway maples, for example, you know, sometimes trees die, and, you know, that isn't because of someone's failure necessarily. You know, there's a limited space, and there are lifespans, and you just understanding that better gives us an opportunity to put our you know, put our voices in ways that are effective. But want to thank you again, both, for coming out tonight.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Fantastic. You all have a good evening. Thanks for joining us.
You
Thank
too.
you. You too.